Hello, hello. Welcome to the webinar, everyone. Some of you may know me, Alexandra Alvarado. I'm the Director of Marketing and Education here at the American Apartment Owners Association. I am very thrilled that you could make it to this webinar. I did a similar topic last year and I thought, why not do it again? Because now we have so much new information. The rental industry landscape has changed. And there's a lot still to learn as it keeps developing, especially when it comes to tenant screening, which we're finding is more important now than ever. So before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of things. One is that this full recording is going to be available tomorrow. I will email it to you along with any other resources, including this PowerPoint that we are referencing here in the presentation. Also, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end, so stick around for that. You can put your questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, if you put your questions in the chat, I will not see it. I will be focusing just on the Q&A box, so please put the questions there. If I can't get to all of them, then I will be sure to reach out to you individually if needed. All right, and then I'm just checking here to make sure everything looks okay on my end. If it does on your end, please go ahead and let me know in the chat that everything sounds and looks okay. We're going to get started with a quick disclosure before we begin. The information that I'm going to provide in this webinar is not legal advice. We're providing this just for your consideration as best practice for housing providers, and this is for educational purposes only. Of course, if you have any questions about anything specific, go ahead and talk to your attorney. We have some great ones too. If you need one, I can refer you. And then also follow your policies. And if I say something that differs, only implement that change upon approval from either your manager or your attorney. Okay, so let's have a very quick, brief overview because I really want to get into a lot of stuff today about where we are now compared to where we were last year. When I did this webinar last year, people were really worried about being able to fill vacancies. Simply put, people were not moving. So they were offering a ton of leasing incentives. Some of them, in my opinion, a little too incentivized, meaning some people were literally just not asking for a security deposit just to get people through the door, things like that, even forgiving rent or giving away rent for free. Today, the landscape is a lot different. We're seeing it completely bounce back. And if anything, it's stronger than ever before. This is an incredibly strong leasing season. What that means is that a lot of property managers and landlords are actually tightening their standards, and they are actually looking at more renters, and they want the best ones, especially after a year of having to deal with eviction moratoriums, which keep getting extended. It becomes more and more important to select only the best tenants that you can. So that's why this presentation is so important today. Another thing I want to note as well, something that we thought would happen is we thought renter credit scores were just going to plummet. And in fact, a TransUnion study, which I'll link in the follow-up, they actually showed that credit scores went up, if you can believe it. It's super counterintuitive, but when you look at what makes up a credit score, the reason why is because a lot of people's debt went down and a lot of people did not take out that extra loan for a fancy car, or maybe they worked out a payment plan with a creditor, and so it reflected positively on their credit report and credit score. Now, what that means is it's not really giving us the whole picture, and we have to do a lot of work to really find out what the true financial status of a tenant is before they move in, and that's going to lead to the lowest risk. So it all starts with the applicant interview. So if you've seen my last presentation, I'm repeating this again because I think it's important. These are some questions I think are very important to ask. Why are you moving? So knowing the reason of somebody's transition is going to be very important to determine what the motivation is. And also, what's the total monthly income, meaning any kind of income, not just from employment, if they're getting any sort of government assistance or retirement, for example, that can be included. How many people will be living in the unit? So something that we have seen is a lot of people moving in together because rent is getting so expensive, because it's so in such high demand and supply is still low and lagging. Can you afford the application fee and security deposit? That will just save everybody time. Can you provide references from previous and current employers and landlords? So this is something that we're going to talk about a little later, and you're going to see exactly why it's so important to ask the right questions to previous landlords and employers and current employers to find out what the person is actually making and whether or not they are paying their rent on time. And also, do you have any questions, which, believe it or not, can reveal so much about where the tenant's mindset is at, and maybe even they can bring up red flags on their own. Do not ask applicants if they are vaccinated at this time. Consult with your attorney. I've read a lot of stories lately in the news where landlords are trying to sort of ask that question either on an application, some of them even requiring it for the person to live in the unit. I don't think that it's just very sketchy. So go ahead and talk to your landlord about it before you ask anything about anything medical to a tenant, and always take notes. So that's extremely important. If you have a call, even just on the phone, make sure you put a date and a time so that you know exactly what you said to the tenant, just in case later on in the future, for whatever reason, you have something to go back on, especially if you get taken to court, hopefully not, but at least if you have a very consistent note-taking process, that's something that can help. All right, so now let's go to the rental application. So let's say you've talked to them, you ask them these questions, they're ready to apply. So what are some best practices on the rental application? One is charge a reasonable and legal application fee. So keep in mind, some states have maximums on their application fee. New York is the lowest at $20. So that may mean that you will have to pay for some of the report out of your own pocket. Or you can order something that's less expensive and get less data, which I wouldn't suggest. But just be aware of what's the most that you can charge a tenant. In California, I think it's like $52 or so. It keeps up with inflation, which is pretty generous. So just check in your state what it is. Now, why even collect an application fee? I get this question a lot. Really what it does is shows that the tenant is interested, that they're not going to flake on you. And then you're not out of pocket for money, especially if you are screening more than 1, 2, 3 applicants for a single unit. So it makes sense. Some landlords I've spoken to, they do refund the application fee if a tenant does qualify for the rental unit and they do end up moving in. So that keeps people really from not applying if they're not qualified as well, because they don't want to spend the application fee money just to get declined. Also, another best practice is to make sure to give a rental application to any occupant over the age of 18. Even if they're not going to contribute to the rent, you should have all of their details. Also, disclose your criteria. So make sure that you are very clear up front as to exactly what your criteria is. And your criteria can be either a specific credit score, it can be a specific amount of income that they need to have. Whatever it is that your criteria is, just go ahead and disclose that. I have another webinar just on how to set criteria, so you can watch that at another time. I can share it with you all, and that really goes over how to determine what kind of criteria to have. Now, keep in mind, there are some states where it's actually required that you disclose the criteria. I think it's a best practice, but in Washington, it is actually legally required for you to disclose it. Also, review applications as they are submitted. I know a lot of landlords love to grab, 10 applications and look at them all together and compare them. But, and that's not necessarily illegal or anything, but you should definitely consider reviewing the applications as they are submitted so that you're giving everyone a fair chance, and it's easier to show that you're not discriminating. So if somebody is coming in, they're the first qualified person or the most qualified person that applied first. And that goes back to taking notes and having the date and time of any rental application that's submitted to you noted either on the rental application or in your journal, wherever you put that information. All right, so we're going to talk about a few scams as we go along. I know in the webinar description I said 8, but we're going to only be able to get to 4 today. But I think these are more relevant to this process of tenant screening. Scam number 1 is lying about a co-tenant. So this is probably the most common one that we see. Make sure that you're meeting all the occupants in person or at least via a video call, which we know nowadays is probably going to be necessary with COVID and all. And then also you can run a credit and background check on every occupant, even a spouse, yes, and a cosigner. So I stop on spouse because that's another question we got a lot. A husband and wife can have completely different credit reports and completely different background checks. Obviously, if a husband commits a crime, it wouldn't be on the wife's criminal report, right? Or vice versa. So make sure that you're getting both. And also, if there is a cosigner, obviously you should get that information for the cosigner as well. I think at least a credit report, right? Because you want to know that they're credit worthy, but also, consider a background check too, just in case. And then another one is to include rules in your lease about unauthorized tenants and guests and tell the applicant. So this is really important. I'm sure your lease says something about this. I would really recommend that you go back to your lease today and take a look at what this is, because this is really important. If you have a tenant who decides to move somebody into the unit after they've moved in, if you don't have a very ironclad guest clause or unauthorized occupant clause in your lease, it could leave you open to liability. It could also leave you open to maybe having that person really considered as a tenant under the eyes of the law, even though you've never even known that they were there. So you have to be very careful with that, and also let the applicant know. So a lot of landlords do have a really great guest clause, but they don't tell the applicant about it. And let me tell you, applicants, they're not going to read the whole lease. The most important thing is that when you are reviewing the lease, after you screen them, make sure that you tell them about this clause. Make sure they even sign next to the clause if they need to, just so that they're very aware of it. Scam number 2 is supplying a fake credit report. So this is incredibly easy to do. I don't think landlords understand how easy it is. Even 20 years ago, it was really easy to use Microsoft Word or Paint to, quickly delete a number and add in a different credit score or whatever it is. So if it's coming from the tenant, you don't know where they got that credit report from. You don't know if they've changed it, right? So don't, as I know you may be tempted to take it because it's easy and it's right there, but I would still say always run your own credit report. The other reason why it's important is even if they give you their actual credit report, again, what credit bureau is it and what score model is it? And then if it's different than the score model and the credit bureau that you're using to analyze all your other tenants, you're not comparing apples to apples. So keep that in mind. That's going to make it a lot more fair as well. Also, I want to point out that just a few weeks ago, Maryland passed legislation that now allows tenants to supply their own credit report. But that doesn't mean that you as a landlord can't get your own. So Maryland, they really want to encourage landlords or to not charge tenants, I think, for application fees without really making that a law. I think what they want to do is really make it easier for tenants so that they don't have to keep paying for, application fee after application fee to get a rental. And I understand that, but at the end of the day, it really puts the landlord at risk if they don't know or they can't verify where the credit report came from. So I would even then still recommend running your own. A background check is going to cost anywhere from $20 to $50. Trust me, even if it's out of your own pocket, because it has to be, it's definitely going to be worth it. And we'll keep an eye out to see if any other states try to pass something like this. Okay, so now let's talk about analyzing a credit report, which is obviously one of the most important parts of a tenant screening. So I want to first start with what is not on a credit report. This actually surprises a lot of landlords. Income is never stated on a credit report. It's not part of their credit score. The employer, sometimes. And when I say sometimes, I mean it's the last known employer that the credit bureau knows about, which means that if they change jobs but didn't apply for another credit card, credit bureau probably doesn't know that they changed jobs. So it's not really the best indicator in real time of where they are currently working. So you still have to verify employment, even if it's on their credit report. Also, utilities rarely on a credit report. So is monthly rent rarely on there. Now, there are some new services. Some of you may have gone to a previous webinar that Spurlonga Data did. They are now helping mom and pop landlords to report monthly rent on credit reports. So it is becoming possible as of the last, I think, year and a half or so, but it's still pretty rare. We just still don't have a ton of landlords doing it. So that's not really a factor. Evictions are also no longer on a credit report as of 2017, really includes civil judgments as well. So civil judgments could be, for example, if you take a tenant to court because they have excessive damages, let's say, okay, and the security deposit didn't cover it, then you take them to court and you get a judgment. Is that on a credit report? No, it's not. Is it on an eviction report? No, because it's not an eviction either. So just be aware that that information is not on the credit report. Also, tax liens, state or federal, also not on a credit report. And as of the last year and a half-ish, loan deferrals under the CARES Act, also never on a credit report. The CARES Act, actually, we'll talk about in a moment, made it so that any loan deferrals, forbearance, whatever you want to call it, is not on a credit report so that it doesn't negatively affect a tenant if the reason was due to COVID. So now let's go into the next part here. So what does this all lead us to? Well, if you're ordering a report on AAOA's website, make sure that you add on a bankruptcies, tax liens, and judgments report. This is a separate report that we have added, not as part of the packages that we have, but it's an add-on. It may be part of the package in the future, but it's really inexpensive. And honestly, it's going to give you a lot more peace of mind because these three, well, bankruptcies are on the credit report, but tax liens and judgments are not. And even when bankruptcies are on the credit report, it's still not like a ton of information. Also, make sure that you order an eviction report. So this is separate. So don't just order a credit report alone. Always add on also an eviction report, which will look at civil lawsuits. Okay, it'll also look at small claims lawsuits. So all of this combined is going to give you way more data than just the credit report alone. Also, check references on your own. That means calling a previous landlord, calling a previous employer yourself, or you can pay us to do it. It depends on how much volume you have. That's sort of where I stand on it. If you have, just a ton of people that you need to do this for, it could be pretty time consuming. We could take that off your hands if you would like. That's also an add-on to tenant screening. But either way, you should be doing it. And also make sure that you're verifying income multiple ways, because as we know, that's also not on a credit report. And if you can, and this is sort of a side note, you can report monthly rental payments once the tenant moves in. And ultimately, that'll help future landlords. And over time, hopefully that'll just be a regular part of a credit report as it starts to catch on. All right, so now let's look at the credit summary. So this is an AAOA report, but it doesn't matter which report you're using because it'll typically give you the same information. So we're looking here at a couple of important parts: the total account balance and the total monthly payment. Why is this so important? It's because it tells you the tenant's debt, and the tenant's debt is going to determine how hard it's going to be for them to make their monthly rental payments. So you want to look at a total account balance, which is total debt, that is relatively low. However, the caveat being that a lot of people have student loans now. So sometimes you'll see an account balance that is really, really high. So if you do see that, try to find out where that balance is coming from and the details of the report, because if it is student loans, honestly, and unfortunately, that is quite normal now. And student loan payments don't really require, at least federal student loan payments don't really require that much payment per month. It's usually extended over the course of 30 years. So it doesn't really affect their total monthly payment, which I think is even more important, right? So that's going to tell you exactly how much they need to pay out of their pocket every month to make their credit card payment, their student loan payment, their auto loan payment, and all of that together. So that's going to give you an idea then of whether or not they can afford your rental income. And then on this right side over here, we have a lot of negative issues that you might see on a credit report. And really, we want to look at, do they have collections? Are they previously past due on any accounts, meaning that they missed a payment or two, but then they caught up? Are they currently past due on any accounts? And also, how past due are they? Was it just a 30-day? Was it 60? Was it 90? And then if there's any public records, which now are really just bankruptcies, obviously that's important as well. So you want to make sure that you're looking at that when you're taking into consideration the credit report. Also, the collections. This is huge, right? If you have tenants who have multiple collections, not only does it affect their credit score, but really it can affect their ability to pay rent, depending on how aggressive the collection agency is at collecting the debt that is owed. So we're going to take a look at this fake example. One, we want to look at what's the type of collection. So a lot of times we see medical collections. And unfortunately, again, people do have a ton of medical debt. Illness can occur, and that can, bring somebody to the brink of bankruptcy in some cases, which is quite sad. But it should not be something that you consider as part of your overall tenant screening process. And in fact, the credit bureaus don't really consider medical collections as part of the credit score anymore. Most of them don't. So that's important. The other thing you want to look at is whether or not the creditor is an apartment complex. So earlier I said there are no evictions or civil judgments listed on a credit report. However, if the landlord or property management company uses a collection agency and they hire that collection agency, then the collection agency can put it on a credit report, but it doesn't happen automatically. And a lot of landlords don't do it either because it's expensive, it takes time, they don't want to use a collection agency, they're over it. So just keep that in mind, that if you do see something like that where the creditor is ABC Apartments, red flag. Also, what's the amount? Is it low? Is it high? So if you obviously have a lot of collection debt, that's a bigger problem. When did it occur? Was it just last year? Because that could be an issue. If it's been a long time, maybe the collection agency has given up on collecting it. So that could give you some indication there. And also if there is a date closed or paid out. So if you do see a date in this area, that means that they have actually paid their debt. And that's okay. I mean, that's something that you should look at, slightly favorably, because that means they may have had an issue financially, but then they caught up and they made good with the creditor. All right, so that wraps up collections. And now still going on to more of the analyzing of the credit report. I mentioned this earlier about the CARES Act. Okay, so what did the CARES Act do and how did it affect credit reports? So for any agreements made between January 31st of 2020 and 120 days after the national emergency ends, so it's still going, the law requires creditors to report any account that has a payment accommodation applied to it as current. So a payment accommodation can be a forbearance, a partial payment, it can be deferral, it can be any sort of arrangement that the creditor has made with the tenant to make their life a little easier because maybe they were affected by COVID. And as long as the account was current when the accommodation was made. So as long as the tenant didn't previously have any issues on that account, this would apply to them. And also, side note, student loans were automatically deferred again until January. So that's something also that you'll see on the credit reports. You may see the student loans, but there will be no monthly payment on it because all student loans were automatically put into forbearance, even if the consumer did not ask for it. So what that means is the only way they would have been making monthly payments is if that consumer went out of their way to contact the Department of Education and ask to make payments, okay? And that's only for public loans. This does not apply for private loans. All right, let's go to scam number 3, falsifying pay stubs and jobs. I'm sure you may have already ran into this at some point if you've been a landlord for some time. Just a quick pointer, a few quick pointers for pay stubs. Make sure that the name, occupation, and date of birth match, that there are no spelling mistakes, digits and decimals should line up. It should look like it's actually made in an accounting software, not Word. The zeros and the O's should look different. Estimations and roundups should be minimal, not rounded to the nearest zero. So there are some things that you can kind of tell when they're fake, but it's still pretty difficult to know for sure. So we're going to talk then about how to verify income in some different ways. So one way is to also ask for a bank statement from the last 30 to 90 days. What you're looking for on that is the amount and the entity of the direct deposits that should match the pay stub details. So nowadays, most people are getting direct deposit for their paycheck. They don't usually get paid in cash anymore. I suppose they could, and that's okay. But if you do see it on the bank statement, that helps. And also the amount paid out for rent as well. So if they're paying rent from their bank, which most people do, most people don't use a credit card, that's going to appear as well. And it could also verify rental income. And last, but certainly not least, you are checking for a healthy savings and checking balance. And this is something, again, that's not on a credit report, but I would much rather have a renter who has a very healthy savings account than a renter who has a good credit score, but a lot of debt and nothing in their bank account. So you want to think of it sort of with the credit report in mind, but also what's outside of the credit report, what finances look like on a day-to-day basis, not just when it comes to their debt. And of course, look for a W-2 and government issued ID. The W-2 or any sort of tax return, if they're self-employed, is really helpful. That gives you an indication at least as to how much income they will be expecting to make in the following year. And also government issued ID, which is going to tell you, if the name matches all of the documentation. Just keep in mind that in states like California, you can't require that they have a social security number or a driver's license, but any sort of ID is fine. So any sort of government issued ID. And then lastly, think about how much income is enough for your rental unit. So this is going to come down to, what do you feel comfortable with? Also, how much debt is the person paying every month? Do they have like a really expensive Tesla, that they have to pay, or do they have no auto loans, very low debt? And then they could use more of that money towards rent. Or do they have a lot of savings? So did you see a lot in that bank statement? And then what's the cost of living in your area? I know we hear a lot of ratios thrown around. They want you to make three times more than what the rent is. That may not be realistic in some areas. Rent is going up a lot faster than people's incomes are going up. Realistically, right now, it's tough to find that. If you can, that's wonderful, but don't get too stuck on a certain number. Look at it holistically. Look at also the debt and the savings and the cost of living in your area and see if it makes sense. All right, so a little bit more on verifying income. So what is income? Okay, this definition is actually from a piece of California legislation. This is how it's defined. In California, I think this is a pretty good definition in general, meaning that a source of income is any lawful verifiable income paid directly to a tenant or representative of a tenant. So what this includes is not just employment. So in California, if someone's not employed, that cannot be the reason that you decline them for the rental. However, you can decline them if they don't have verifiable income or if they don't have sufficient income. Now, where can the income come from if they're not employed? It can come from federal, state, or local public assistance, or federal, state, or local housing subsidies, including but not limited to federal housing assistance vouchers. So this is not just a California thing now. There are actually other states that have joined in to basically make it so that landlords cannot discriminate against Section 8 housing vouchers. So they must be considered as traditional applicants would be. So just keep in mind what the laws in your state are. But I think if you can verify other sources of income like child support or retirement or any sort of veterans assistance, you can consider some applicants if they have enough income when you add it all together. All right, so now the next, and I think one of the best ways to verify income, which is employment references. So one thing we want to do is hop on LinkedIn, obviously, look there, most people are on it, and also verify that the company actually exists. You may want to look it up in the Secretary of State, check out their website, locate their phone number or email, maybe both. If you do give them a call, ask for their HR department. Your tenant may have given you a supervisor's information on the application. I would suggest still calling the main line to get to the supervisor or to get to HR, just in case they gave you a phone number of a friend. Also, make sure that you have the signed application, which includes a release ready. That way, if the employer needs to see that the tenant has given you permission to do this, you have it ready to go. You can email it to them or fax them. Not all employers require it, but a lot of them do. And also keep in mind, a lot of companies don't disclose salary, and some of them that do will charge you a fee. They sometimes use a third party to handle all of their salary information. These are usually really big companies like your Walmarts of the world and whatnot. So just keep that in mind that you may not get salary information, but you'll at least know that they work there. And if you do pay extra for that information, I would say it's worth it. Also, scam number 4, which is phony landlord references. This is also one you may have ran into. Just a few tips on how to avoid or detect, I guess, this scam is to search public homeowner records. So if they were living with a mom and pop landlord, then their names should be somewhere recorded, right? If it's a big apartment complex, maybe not, maybe it's under something else. Also, you may want to call them and ask, tell them, I'm interested in learning more about your rental. And they'll say, what? If they're not a landlord. If they are, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. They'll probably say which one, or I don't have a rental available right now. And that way you can at least know that they are actually a landlord. And make sure that you ask the right questions. So at the end of this presentation, I have a few free forms that I'm going to be providing to you. One of them is a landlord questionnaire. These are questions that we ask here at AAOA when we do a landlord verification for you. You can certainly use those questions yourself if you'd like, and I'll go ahead and share that at the end. But once you have that information, you're going to have a lot more peace of mind. All right, moving on to criminal records and best practices for that. This is a kind of a long section, okay? So please bear with me, but it is very important because there is so much at stake if you do this wrong. So one is, I want to start just by mentioning the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is the FCRA. FCRA filtering removes any adverse item of information that is older than 7 years, measured from the file date. So any records that you're getting from our system or from any tenant screening provider is going to be within that 7-year window, okay? Not really anything to say about that, just, FYI, okay? And then there are also some other filterings that need to be done for specific areas. Colorado and Detroit, Michigan actually have gone further than the federal Fair Credit Reporting Act, and they decided they want to limit it to 5 years. Here at AAOA and Tenant Alert, for those of you calling in from Tenant Alert, automatically filters that for you, so you don't have to worry about seeing records that you shouldn't be looking at. But if you are doing your own research, be aware that your state may or may not have a shorter window than 7 years. And expect more to come. So this is sort of trending now. It's in a lot of conversations about how far back landlords can go to review criminal records. So just keep that in mind as we progress. Also, let's look at what has changed, okay? So we've seen a growing number of renters with incomes between $30,000 and $75,000 that are now cost burdened. They're paying more than 30% of their income for housing. This is according to a Harvard study done a couple of years ago. We're seeing homelessness on the rise, and landlords and property managers believe that leasing and renting to an ex-offender is too great a risk. So taking all that into consideration, there has been a regulatory response to that. And what we see now is that landlords can't require disclosure of criminal history on applications. There's a preclusion of policies that automatically exclude people with criminal histories, meaning that you can't just say no criminals, okay? There are some caveats to that I'll go over in a moment, but generally that's the case now. And the HUD Office of Guidance, which was of GC Guidance, which was implemented in 2016, basically is what they did was they defined intentional discrimination versus disparate impact. So intentional discrimination is what we would normally think of as discrimination. And you may look at that and say, I would never intentionally discriminate against anyone. The one that you need to be worried about is disparate impact. That's when you're unintentionally discriminating and you have facially neutral policies, meaning that on paper, they look neutral, but they affect different minorities in a way that is adverse. And that's just the result or the consequence of the policy, but not the intent of the policy. And so that's where they're coming from, is that having a blanket policy of no criminal history is seemingly neutral, but because minorities are arrested and convicted of crimes at a higher rate, that it does unintentionally discriminate more towards minorities than others. So what are the best practices? The Act does not prohibit housing providers from appropriately considering criminal history. So don't think that this means you can't consider criminal history ever, but you can have arbitrary or overbroad criminal history related bans that they're likely to just lack a legally sufficient justification. So what it comes down to is, if you get taken to court, what is the reason that you're going to give that you declined the applicant, and is that legally sufficient of a reason? So HUD has some guidelines that they think you should go through to make sure that you have a legally sufficient justification. This is not really law per se, these are guidelines, but my advice is to follow the guidelines, right? If HUD is telling you how to avoid a lawsuit. So what you want to look at is the type of crime. Does it actually have a negative impact or pose a risk to the rental property or any residents thereof? And also the date of the crime. How long ago did this happen? You know, we talked about that 7-year window, but even a crime that occurred right as that window was closing, 6 years ago, is that still relevant today? Does that still pose a risk today? And how do you determine if it does? Well, you look at their efforts to rehabilitate, right? You want to see whether or not they've had a steady job, they started a family, maybe it happened when they were very young, they made a mistake, they learned from it. So you want to make sure that you're looking at every individual and looking at exactly, these factors, instead of just saying no criminals, don't even apply. So that's where it's coming from. And lastly, if you're unsure or the record is incomplete, that does happen sometimes on these instant searches. You may see like a hidden field or a partial date of birth or something like that. Give us a call because we can go ahead and investigate it further. You certainly want to make sure that you have the correct applicant and that you have all the information you need. And we are always here to help you. So please give us a call. If you haven't noticed already, our phone number is at the bottom of every screen, and we can help you with this Monday through Friday. All right, so now let's go over to eviction records. So this is going to get interesting. We keep seeing in the news, there's going to be this huge tsunami of evictions coming. I don't know that that's necessarily going to happen, but you may be seeing more eviction records than you may have in the past when screening tenants. So you want to sort of think about how you're going to consider these records when it comes to screening. But that aside, I just want to point out the National Consumer Assistance Plan, which was established by the 3 credit bureaus in 2017, essentially eliminated eviction records from the credit bureaus, from the credit reports. So again, just reiterating again that the eviction records are not on a credit report. They don't affect the credit score unless the landlord or property management company has used a collection agency to collect a judgment, and then they report that. So another thing to note as well is that in California, you can only consider evictions that are actually closed. So if a landlord has filed an eviction on the tenant, you can't consider that. So at AEOA, we automatically filter that out for you, and Tenant Alert does too. So you don't have to worry about seeing something you shouldn't be seeing. However, if you're doing your own research, just be aware that you can't use just pending evictions. In New York City, it's sort of blurry gray line. You may want to talk to an attorney if you're in that area, any of the 5 boroughs. They issued out a couple of years ago a legislation that was a little unclear as to how to consider eviction records. And honestly, we've had clients on both sides of the fence. And so far, we haven't seen any major legislation for landlords, we haven't seen any major lawsuits against landlords doing that in New York City, but the law, it can be interpreted in either way. So I would suggest if you're in New York City and you're looking at eviction records, to talk to an attorney. And lastly, also important, if you see this on any of our reports where the previous address history has no results, that is a red flag, and it does relate to evictions because, believe it or not, most eviction records don't have a date of birth and they don't have a social security number on them. It's just the name and the address. So how do we know John Smith living at 123 Main Street is the same John Smith who's applying to your rental? It's a common name, right? So what we do is we take the social security number and we pull up all of the addresses associated with that social security number. And we check and cross-reference eviction records with those addresses and the name. So then we know that the social you gave us matches those addresses, even though they're not on the record itself. So if you get back a warning that there are no previous addresses, make sure that you double check you entered the social security number correctly, that the name has been also entered correctly. And if they both have been entered correctly, it could be that the person has no paper trail, meaning that they are either too young, maybe too new to the country, or they just don't really have any history because they maybe have had roommates their whole life or never had a bill in their name, which is rare, but I'm sure it could happen. So just be aware when you see that. Really, the only address that's being checked is the one address that the tenant is providing. So if you want to look for more than just that one address, you got to have a previous address history and a good social and name to go with it. All right, a couple other things I want to point out here. Cities and states with fair housing ordinances are trending. So we talked about the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There's the Fair Housing Act. We have all these federal acts, but now we also have cities and states that are implementing their own policies on how to handle criminal reports and also rental applications, and also how to decline a tenant as well, which they call an adverse action. So which ones are those? I'm going to just list the ones that I know, but to be honest, there may be more because these develop pretty quickly. I try to stay in the know, but check in your area if there is something like this. And like I mentioned, what these fair housing ordinances do is they either require you to have a specific process for declining a tenant, specific reasons for declining them. Either way, though, even if you're not in these places, I do recommend that you provide an adverse action letter. We call it a declination letter as well. We have a free one on our website. If you ever order a tenant screening report with us or with Tenant Alert, you'll see that there is a declination letter automatically included in every report. So you can use it. We do encourage you to, in fact, just so that it's clear what the tenant's rights are, and also that they're being notified just in case you're supposed to be notifying them. And what this all concludes to is there's a growing risk of consumer class action lawsuits for noncompliance. And class action lawsuits usually target larger property management companies or landlords with over 100 units, but certainly it is something to be aware of and concerned for if you are not following these rules properly. And the actual violations could result in damages, punitive civil penalties, private lawsuits, equitable relief, criminal liability, even in some areas. So be sure that you're up to date on that. I wish I could go through all of them, but there's so many to go through, and they all seem to have different pieces of legislation that keep cropping up. So we'll try to keep you in the know as it happens. All right, so let's move on to non-traditional applicants. Take a sip of water. All right, so who are our non-traditional applicants? These are people who are very young. Maybe they just started college the first time living away from home. Maybe they came from another country, or maybe they're self-employed. They don't really have consistent income. So how do you screen those people? So we can use an ITIN number, which is an individual taxpayer identification number if they don't have a social security number. So a lot of people who come to this country, they'll use an ITIN for a long time until they're able to get a social security number. An ITIN has the same number of digits as a social, and it's used in place of a social to apply for a credit card, for example, or to start a credit history as well. So that is something you can ask for as an alternative. If they don't have either one, then unfortunately you can't get a credit report, but they probably don't have any credit history anyway. Also, the only good thing about that is that if they have no credit history or credit report, well, they have no debt, right? So you can look at that in sort of a positive way. If they have no debt and they have a great bank account, I mean, why not? It seems like, they're pretty responsible. You can maybe go with that. Now, the other thing you could do is ask for a US cosigner who does actually have a credit history. I know a lot of landlords prefer cosigners that are in the rental state. I do recommend that. It makes it easier if you do have to take the tenant and the cosigner to court in the future. But you certainly could have one out of state too. It's just a little more complex. So just be aware of that. And also make sure that you're checking their credit history, obviously, right? So that you know that they're financially capable, just in case the tenant can't make the rent payments. And list them on the lease, of course. And then also you could ask them for additional references. So going beyond just landlord and employer, okay, they don't have a credit report. Maybe they have a letter from a professor or from an athletics department if they're a college student. That's something that I actually did with my first landlord. When I was 18, I didn't have any rental history. So I had, my professor and the company where I was interning all pitch in and write something for me so that I could get approved for a rental, and it worked. I'm really happy that the landlord saw that very positively. So you could ask for additional character references. You could, for international applicants, ask us if we can get you a quote for an international background check. They do exist. The only issue is, depending on where it's located, can be a little expensive, or it can take longer than a week to get the results back. So you kind of just have to ask so that we can check it out, because it changes as well. So depending on where it is, I think Canada is usually the easiest to process. So just let us know. We could check it out for you. And lastly, you can require lease guarantee, which we'll talk about in just a second. All right, so lease guarantee, and this will be our last section here. So what is lease guarantee? Some of you may have seen it on our credit reports. So what lease guarantee does is it reimburses landlords for court judgments anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000, depending on which policy you get. So with court judgments, as we know, you can take a tenant to court. You may have one right now that you're thinking about, that you are waiting to take to court when the moratorium ends. Now you take them to court and they move out, great. Now, how are you going to get that money that they owe you? Depending on how much they owe you, it may never happen. So what the lease guarantee does is, when you do get that court judgment, the lease guarantee will pay it immediately. So that is definitely an advantage, especially if you have a non-traditional tenant. You certainly could get lease guarantee for them and have them pay for the lease guarantee as part of their approval process. So some quick facts. Collection agencies have under a 17% success rate. So even if you use a collection agency, you still probably won't see that judgment that you got. And I don't know the source on this one, it may be a little off, but they say 80% of judgments are never collected. So that's pretty high. And so just a couple benefits: it protects your rental income. You can fill a vacancy faster, technically, because you can accept more applicants that you might normally not have, so those non-traditionals, and you can help them qualify. And ultimately, even if they're not a non-traditional applicant, you can still get peace of mind knowing that if anything goes wrong, at least if you take them to court, you're going to see that money. So and just in terms of the cost, I don't want to make this a big sales presentation, but I know this is going to be a question. These are the different rates for the different amounts of protection. You choose which rate, which amount of protection you want. Okay. And then you decide, are you going to pay for it, or do you want the tenant to pay for it? So if the tenant is going to pay for it, you can add it on to a security deposit. You can use it instead of a cosigner or in addition to a cosigner if they don't have any credit of their own. You can also reduce security deposit if they are a very qualified tenant and you want to reward them. And if you pay for it, then you could just charge the tenant yourself, maybe go 50-50 with them on it, or use it as an investment and just know that you're lowering your risk, and that's a lot of value for you too. So lease guarantee is available whenever you screen a tenant on Tenant Alert or AAOA. A lease guarantee offer is included. Most tenants are going to qualify. Almost all of them will. The only difference is their rate might be higher if they are higher risk. And this is sort of about lease guarantee, but also just in general. Attorney's fees and cost clause. So in your lease agreement, you'll have one of two clauses. One is where in the event of any sort of legal action that the prevailing party recovers from the other party attorney's fees and litigation costs, meaning if you win, you get to collect on those legal fees. And then lease guarantee can cover that because it will be part of a judgment. So if you have lease guarantee, I would suggest this clause. Just be aware, if the tenant sues you and the tenant wins, they can also ask for those attorney's fees and litigation costs from you. So just a side note. And the other option is to say, well, no matter who wins, we each will bear our own attorney's fees and costs. You could do that, but if you have the lease guarantee, it won't be part of the judgment. So the attorney's fees and costs won't be included in that and it won't be covered. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I linked an article here at the bottom that we had an attorney write for us all about this and the pros and cons of each. All right, so we talked about some resources. I will send them in the follow-up email tomorrow. Basically, we have some great forms on our site that I would suggest you use. A comprehensive rental application, which does have a release of information, so you can take that to an employment reference or landlord reference if they need proof. Also, the adverse action declination letter, landlord reference questionnaire, lease guarantee addendum. So you want to tell the tenant probably that there's a lease guarantee on them, just so that they are aware that if something does happen, they are still liable for the debt. It's just going to be paid out to lease guarantee. And also move in, move out checklist. Very important to have, especially if you want to maybe have a fair security deposit conversation with your tenants in the future. And we also have a free pet addendum as well. Premium forms that I would suggest, you do have to pay for these, but we do have a state-specific lease agreement, which is pretty ironclad, and also state-specific disclosures that are required. So for example, if you're in California, you have to give a bed bugs agreement and a mold agreement and a lead paint disclosure. So you want to make sure that you have all those. If you use our premium forms and you say, okay, my rental is in California, it's going to populate everything that you need along with the lease. And there's a ton of other premium forms as well that we have, not just the lease agreement, but in reference to what we're talking about today, I think that's the most important. And you can go to our site, to our landlord forms, to see that. All right, so that was a lot. Thanks for sticking with me. That concludes the presentation here. Please take the exit survey when you head out. We are doing a survey, and the winner of the survey is going to get a $50 Amazon gift card. So please take the time to answer that. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how you're handling COVID. So now that I can finally look at the Q&A, David is asking, will you send slides or recording of the webinar? Of course, I'll send that to you tomorrow. It'll also be posted on the AAOA website tomorrow. So if whatever email you registered with, that's where you're going to get it. All right, so Ina Kite, is the judgment or eviction search covering the entire US, or is it just statewide? For example, what if a tenant is moving from one state to another? Great question. So we have both options on our site, and so does Tenant Alert. You can do statewide or nationwide eviction search. If the tenant has lived in more than one state in the last 7 years, I would recommend the nationwide eviction search so that you're capturing all the data everywhere. Pamela asking if there's a printout of the slides available. There will be. I'll send it to you tomorrow in a PDF format so you can print it out. Will tenant insurance cover damages like fire or ruining the carpet, tiles? If you're referencing lease guarantee, sort of. So with lease guarantee, if you take the tenant to court for a large amount of maybe damages, yes, lease guarantee would cover that court judgment if it's for damages related to the rental. However, if it's not like traditional insurance where if there's a fire or something like that, that would not actually, like accidental damages would actually not be covered. For that, you should have your own multifamily insurance, and you should always ask for your tenants to get renter's insurance. I think landlords, for some reason, think renter's insurance is for the renter. Obviously, it says renter's insurance, but it's also for the landlord too, because if something happens to the renter's possessions, they don't have to go to the landlord to claim that loss. They can go to their insurance provider. Keeps landlords out of the loop, reduces your liability and risk as well. So please, if you don't already, require renter's insurance, get property insurance, and get lease guarantee for those other sort of losses like not paying rent. All right, so let's see here. Will the question and answer questions be on transcripts? We can certainly look into that. I mean, we'll have the recording. Maybe we can make this into a transcript, although it will take us probably more than just a day to get that done, but I'll be in touch if we do it. Mindy asking, can the association help us with specific issues? And she's listing here a situation about a refrigerator dispute with the tenant. So definitely, Mindy, call us so we can point you in the right direction. We're not attorneys per se, but we have a ton of information and resources, and we know a lot of great attorneys as well that we can refer you to. So certainly don't be shy, give us a call, send me an email, it's up on the screen. I will personally respond to you. All right, let's see here. Many jurisdictions do not include eviction data in their data feeds. If my area does not put eviction data in feeds, will your information still include eviction data? I think there may be, it's more for criminal. There are some criminal jurisdictions that don't disclose data or all the date, like date of birth, for example. And it's sort of spotty. It's like all over the US in different tiny towns and counties here and there. The biggest one that I can think of is the 5 bureaus in Manhattan. So in New York, for example, they have criminal data, but we can't access it. The charge for it is, I think, over $100 to access criminal data. If any crime was committed in, Queens, New York, that's how much you have to pay to get that information. So there are some places like that. I would suggest when you do get a tenant, if you're curious, give us a call. Let us know where that tenant has been living, and we can tell you exactly if we have that data for you. But for the most part, it's going to cover almost everyone. I never heard of reporting unpaid rental balances to the credit reporting agencies. You report to the 3. So we actually don't do it. Spurlonga Data does. They're one of our partners, and they actually have to 2 credit bureaus. They're working on getting the 3rd one as well. But I will say that even just having 2 credit bureaus report the rental payments does so much to encourage tenants to pay rent on time, because there's an immediate consequence. You don't have to take them to court, and then you don't have to also hire a collection agency. So it's pretty immediate, right? It's within like a 30-day time window, because that's how long it takes to report everything to the credit bureaus. So if the person hasn't still paid rent 30 days after their due date, then certainly it would show up on their credit report, and you wouldn't really have to do anything extra if you're already reporting. All right, let's see here. Okay. Spurlonga, Sperlonga. Melissa, that's how you spell it. All right. Maria, do I accept all applications, but do I need to answer everyone if I'm declining them? So I think what helps with that, Maria, is if you provide specific criteria when the person is calling you or applying, so they know what your criteria is. And a lot of them may just decline themselves essentially and not even apply if they know what your criteria is and that they're not going to meet it. Then if they do meet all your criteria, you should always offer an application to everyone. Actually, you should offer an application to everyone, even if they don't even if they don't meet all your criteria, because you want to make sure that you're not discriminating against anyone, that you're not preventing or discouraging anyone from applying, regardless of the reason, right? So give them an application. If they want to fill it out, if they want to pay for the application fee that you've set, let them. And then if they don't qualify, make sure you tell them why. And again, the declination letter that I will be providing you tomorrow will have specific language that our attorneys have written that will keep you out of trouble and us as well. So I can go ahead and share that with you. And let's see, another one from Liana. Does a student loan of $50,000 not paid considered a bad debt for a renter? Liana, no, it's not a bad debt. And the reason why is because a lot of times people get themselves into really high student loans, but what that results in is usually a higher paying job. So if they have the big loan, but they have a good job and they have good savings, that can certainly be considered a neutral thing, right? If they have the debt, they don't have the job, and they're having trouble paying that debt, then it's sort of an issue because it could affect their ability to pay rent to you. So you kind of need to do it on a case-by-case basis. The other thing as well that I would consider is what's the monthly payment on that loan? Because now there's a lot of what's called income-driven repayment plans. So what that means is if you're making less money and you have a federal student loan, you can actually ask the Department of Education to reduce the payments for some time. And then as your income increases, you'll start to pay more of the student loan off. The other option, they could consolidate their loans. So there's lots of different ways that even if you did have a lot of debt in student loans, that you could make it workable so you could at least start to pay some of it off. And as I mentioned, nobody's really paying anything right now until January anyway, because everyone's loans have been automatically put into forbearance. And so in January, they're going to start to probably need to pay those. So if you do have an applicant that has student loans, you may want to ask them how much they were paying pre-pandemic, because the credit report's not going to tell you how much they're going to have to start paying in January. So let's see here. How do you report a non-payment of rent to the credit bureau? So Sam, again, go to Sperlonga, SPERLONGA, to take a look at that. It's fairly affordable to report it. All right, and let's see here. I have gone through all the Q&A in the Q&A box. So let's see, I'll go through the chat, even though I wasn't planning to hear. If you guys are okay with staying just a few minutes longer, I know we're a little over the time here. Let's see here. Okay, Elizabeth saying she's a new landlord and would like the information about how to set a criteria. I'll put that in the follow-up email as well. I think that's really helpful when you're starting off, or if maybe only had like one rental unit and now you're growing. Setting criteria is just such an important part of the rental screening process. Not only are you saving yourself time, you're saving the tenants time as well. By letting them know exactly what you're comfortable with. And when you start getting applicants, it's so much easier to make a decision because you're not going to go based off of, oh, like I feel bad for this person, and then what that leads to is you're treating maybe some people differently than others, right? When you have criteria that is very objective, meaning you have numbers backing that up and you're using a credit report and a background check to verify that information, that's when it's a lot easier to make a decision, especially now that there's so much demand for rentals and you may be getting a ton of rental applicants. How do you determine which one's the best one? In fact, some of them it may be the case where you have the problem of having too many good renters, right? So just keep in mind that you have, the criteria that makes sense for your area, for your rental, for your risk tolerance. I'll send you that in the follow-up email. Okay, so it says here, and I got called out for this. I thought I would. I said 8 scams and I only talked about 4. So the other 4 scams are actually part of after the tenant moves in. I think I said 8 just because we had written an article recently and I thought I would include them all, but I don't think the other 4 make sense, but I can go over them right now with you. So one of them is when a tenant tries to wire you funds for a security deposit or first month's rent, and then you receive the funds, they move in, and then the funds they retract them, they don't actually go through. So that's something that could happen. Also, not paying rent and knowing that they can pay rent and really going around the eviction moratorium rules that are supposed to be for people who need the rent forgiven, or they need the rent deferred, and they in fact may have a job or may have income of some sort that they're not reporting. So unfortunately, with these other tenant scams per se, at the end of the day, those you can't really prevent directly. Really what it comes down to is picking a good tenant from the start, which is what this whole presentation has been about. So that's why I didn't go into it as much. I didn't think it made as much sense, because honestly, if you go through this entire presentation and you apply all of these concepts, you should theoretically not run into as many of those other 4 tenant scams that happen after the tenant moves in, because you've already moved in a great tenant. All right. Thanks, Michelle. I'm glad that made sense to you. All right, Rhonda saying, what credit score is reasonable, 650 or greater? You know, it really is more than the credit score. So yeah, you could have like a minimum if you wanted to make it 650. That is actually where we consider it. You'll see it on our chart. It goes from yellow to green. So it's right at that border where it's starting to become yellow. And that's okay. But then maybe you could have other criteria as well. Like, for example, we don't want to see any collections from any apartment buildings, for example, or your monthly income has to be a certain amount. So again, what really goes into a credit score is not necessarily the same thing that would also make a great renter. So for example, like if I have more credit cards and I've been paying them on time for more years, I may have more debt, but I may have a higher credit score than somebody who has fewer credit cards and maybe just started using credit cards, but has never missed a payment and has low debt. As a landlord, which one do you prefer? Or we see the case where people may make X amount of dollars per month, but a large percentage of that is going towards their auto loan. So you want to make sure that even if they have a good score and they do pay their bills on time, if financially it makes sense, if the reason and the data that they have that score is also going to line up with what your criteria is and what makes you comfortable for the rental. Maria asking, should they see the property first? So certainly if they want to, right? This really comes down to, as we transition out of the pandemic, are you still doing virtual showings, you know, where you're sort of holding a camera and doing a Zoom showing, or are you, you know, now just going to do that permanently, where maybe you have a lock that they can access on their own if you've already sort of met them on a video call. I mean, certainly if they want to see the property first and you're comfortable seeing them in person and they're comfortable too, that's something that you could do, but you should be still prepared to have some people who are not yet comfortable seeing other people in person, and some solutions for that if you need to. All right, let's see if there's anyone else that I missed here. This is a good one. Yes, Stephanie, we did include this scam in our most recent article about basically a tenant taking your rental ad and posting it entirely to Craigslist before they've been accepted and then seeking the deposits or subleasing to someone else. That does happen a lot. Definitely look on Craigslist, and I would say Airbnb, any of the vacation rental websites as well. Even once the tenant moves in, a lot of them could be illegally subleasing. If that's something that you don't allow in your lease, or if it's literally illegal in your city, because a lot of cities are doing that now where they don't allow Airbnbs, then that's certainly a reason why you could take them to court for a breach of contract. Although, with court backups, it's kind of tough, but at least you'll know. So I think checking and just do a Google search for your address or for, your area. You may find, if you find your rental listed somewhere and you didn't list it, that certainly could be someone trying to scam you or just sublease without your permission. Melissa says, I always do 720 plus for the credit score with money and savings. It's really risky when your credit reflects all your debt. It scares me, the possibility of not having high credit and savings. I'm in New York. Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's extremely difficult right now because some of that debt is just not on a credit report right now. So, as we transition out of the pandemic, the CARES Act will expire and student loans, for example, will go back into play. That kind of thing will start to get re-reflected on credit reports. But to me, the fact that people's credit scores went up during the pandemic says it all, right? So that really is not an indicator and on its own of financial health. It does not mean that you should not run a credit report. It doesn't matter. It still matters. The score still matters. All of it matters. But a lot of other stuff matters too. And that's not the only thing you should be looking at. And just be aware of what's not on there. And also, hopefully you're also running other reports and doing your own research as well to really see if that person with the 720 plus credit score actually has that money in the savings as well, and all of the other bells and whistles that you need to feel comfortable to rent to them. Oh, interesting. Go Lang saying, what if they start a business at the property? I think you mean like, what if they start their own business, they don't tell you about it, and maybe they have people coming in and out of the property, if that's a problem. I mean, you certainly could put something in your lease that states that. I haven't really come across it too often, but if that's something that does concern you, put it in your lease as well. And if you put anything in your lease that's important to you, you want the tenant to really know about it, make sure you point it out, you highlight it, you have them sign next to it, whatever it takes to really make them understand that this is serious and that there are consequences to not following some of your lease clauses. Okay. All right. And Eileen saying, personally seeing the property by themselves. Okay. Yes. I do agree. If it's possible to see the person, that's always going to be preferred. That way, you know who it really is, right? Or to have a video call with them if they're at the property. So that's something that a lot of managers did over the pandemic, is you schedule the person to come in to see the property. You don't go in with them. You just leave the key out or something. And then they come in, and while they're there, you can have them call you, video call. So they can FaceTime you on their phone or do the Zoom on their phone so that you can actually see them there and know that it's actually them that's viewing the property. Interesting, Howard, where credit scores in New York City specifically, he thinks went down during the pandemic and that a lot of good tenants left. That certainly could be the case. So every city is a little different. We have a lot of people exiting large urban areas, going into less expensive areas as work from home is becoming more common. So certainly that could happen where we have some good tenants leaving some urban areas, and maybe they're going to inland to other places that are more affordable. And there were a lot of landlords in New York City giving away a ton of concessions, which I think also would reduce the quality of tenants. So definitely, Howard, last year, that's all we were seeing was concessions. And it had me worried because I thought of a lot of landlords that were giving concessions that were actually very, were just not beneficial for the landlord in the long run, which certainly should have the best setup there as you can. All right, let's see what else we have here. All right, can you still hear me? I think I might have lost sound. If you can still hear me, I'll go ahead and finish the last question about marijuana smoking, on an application, yes, you can ask for that. It doesn't matter if they are medically taking the marijuana or not. You can have a no smoking policy. Federally, it's still an illegal substance and Schedule I drug. So that is actually something you can decline someone for or ask them about on the application still. All right. Thanks, Gary, for confirming that. Do we have a lease agreement? Lease agreement. Yes, we do have a lease agreement, but it is a premium form. So just so you know, it's $30 for a month of access to 150 plus different premium forms, including a lease agreement specific to your state. That is included also with the pro membership if you do want to become an annual member of the association. Or you could do a year round of premium access to forms, which is 12 months, and that would be $59.99 on its own. Or if you become a Pro Plus member, which is an annual member as well, then that's included. The Pro Plus membership is $149 per year. It also includes all of our webinars and recordings and resources and free tenant screenings and discounts on that. So if you do have questions about our membership and our association, go ahead and shoot me an email or give us a call. I'd love to help you all with that. So with that being said, I really appreciate all of you joining me on the call today. I hope you learned something new. Please take the survey as you exit. I really want to hear your feedback. And if you do answer all those questions, I'll make sure you get entered to win a $50 Amazon gift card. I'll send you all the recording tomorrow, the PowerPoint slides, and all these great resources. And I really do appreciate your time today. I hope you all have a wonderful day and stay safe, everyone. Take care.